So Antifa is making news continually. A lot of the mainstream media is trying to stay away from it because Joe Biden has to continue to be propped up as the poster boy that can only bring unity and do no wrong. Now, obviously, we're not going to really see any more coverage of what's going on with the civil unrest across the United States, East, West Coast, Middle America, wherever you look. Black Lives Matter, Antifa has made it very clear that they're not going away. So I wanted to kind of dive deeper into that. I have a very special guest tonight, just to give him a bit of an introduction. I have Andy Ngo with me tonight. Andy Ngo is an American journalist, best known for covering protests in Portland, Oregon. He has written columns in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, National Review, and others. His series for the New York Post on Portland's fake hate crime industry became a viral sensation. He drew national attention when he was attacked by Antifa on the streets of Portland in the summer of 2019. He currently serves as an editor-at-large for the Post Millennial. He also has a new book out titled Unmasked. What it does is it takes readers inside of Antifa and the future of leftist violence. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome Mr. Andy Ngo to the podcast tonight. What's going on, bro?
Thanks for having me on, Drew.
Thank you. I'm so glad. I asked Andy to please smile when we introduce him tonight because every time I watch Andy Ngo on an interview, he's just so serious. And I'm guilty of the same thing, bro. When you watch me on interviews, I'm just super serious. But I wanted to see an Andy Ngo smile tonight. So thank you, Andy Ngo, for giving us this smile. So Andy, if you can give yourself just a brief little background to kind of like piggyback on what I already introduced you to. What do you do? What's your thing? Why do you do it? Andy Ngo.
I'm most known for my coverage of Antifa. I originally started in 2016 as a student journalist, and at that time I was doing writing and video for the student paper at Portland State where I was studying. And then 2017 through 2018 and 2019, I tried to focus more on doing on-the-ground video protest coverage because what I was frustrated with was that the local journalists at that time were not informing the public accurately about this growing threat in my home city of Portland, Oregon. They were always describing Antifa as merely anti-fascists who were opposing racist and white supremacy rather than the violent extremists that they are. And then, so I thought at the time that video would be more convincing than writings because people can always accuse a writer of making up things, but video is much harder to fabricate. So that's how I started gaining a small profile regionally in the Pacific Northwest. 2019, I was beaten while covering one of the Antifa riots in downtown Portland, and I was hospitalized with a brain hemorrhage. And ever since then, I've continued to do what I was doing before, finding creative new ways to cover them, doing more writing, digging into the background, and then eventually it led into a big project that became Unmasked, my new book that is out now.
Gotcha. So let's get into Unmasked because it's a big deal when someone drops a book. It's a big deal, especially the content that's inside of your book. A lot of controversy came out because of that in your hometown. I want to ask you about that as well. But overall, what's the goal of Unmasked? If you can give us just like a brief kind of overview, like a 30,000 bird eyes view. What's the goal with Unmasked, your new book?
Antifa can be quite difficult for even people who report on extremism to understand. So journalists, I think a lot of them were not doing the public well because they actually didn't really understand what Antifa is. So to the average layman, they're probably even more confused, much less than those who are already really plugged into politics. So the goal of Unmasked is to provide a one source book that people can read to understand Antifa's history, ideology, organizing tactics, kind of all in one place. A lot of the literature that is currently out at Antifa, and there's not very much, but the few that there are is usually by people who are supportive of it, such as Mark Bray. So I've been open about my criticisms of Antifa, but it's not just like a criticism of them because I disagree. Um, it's my opposition to their violent extremism, and I think that's a position that journalists all should take. I mean, they always tell us that they need to call out racism in their reporting and all that. From me, I have the same impulse in that we need to call out violent extremism when we see it, and that's what Antifa are.
Gotcha. Andy, if we could just dive into your book a little bit, because I wanted you to really expound on that even further. If you could kind of pick out somewhere in your own book that, what's your favorite part? Like, what's your favorite part in your book that you find yourself really just kind of like peeling the veil back, like showing who these people really are? I mean, you and I know who these people are. We've been on the streets. We've heard them. I mean, we've even had conversations with them without them even knowing. I've been in cars with these people without them even knowing, like texting you at certain times. So what is your favorite part in the book that you really kind of want to make sure? Obviously, you want people to read the whole thing, but what's your favorite part in the book to you?
I think what is probably the most important chapter in the book is the one called Rose City Antifa, because for the book, I was able to get my hands on some primary documents that were leaked to me by somebody who went through the recruitment membership process for an Antifa organization. And Rose City Antifa is one of the largest and oldest ones in the US. It's based in Portland. And you'll see I publish in their forewords the curriculum that they have and some of the email correspondence that they send to their members. And you'll see that it is extremely organized. It's really radical. And by radical, I don't just mean in the sense that these are like radical ideas, but like extreme. So in the curriculum, you'll see that the recruits are introduced to more and more extremist literature over a course of weeks and months. So it's a radicalization process that takes a really long time. In addition to introducing them to the theory that will form the basis for their ideological beliefs, there are things like weapons training and training how to hurt and maim your opponents. They held these meetings in secret at one of the bookstores in Portland. It's the bookstore has since been closed out of business, but this is primarily the organizing model for Antifa. There's a lot that you can see that they do in the open, like on Twitter and such, but more the criminal activities that are planned ahead of time are done in encrypted chats and behind closed doors.
It's absolutely true. Like, even when I started first reporting on Antifa undercover, I didn't quite understand who they were. So like I would make mistakes, right? Like a lot of people don't understand. Like when you see the leaf blower thing, when you see them running around in black bloc, when you see them with radios, sometimes they're not in black bloc with radios. Like there's an entire playbook to what these people do. Like they don't even the public doesn't understand when Joe Biden comes out and says they're not an organization, they're an idea. It's like, no, they're extremely organized. Like if you and I tell a lot of journalists on the ground too that kind of want to do what we do, I'm like, hey, you need to make sure you know what you're doing, because they know what they're doing, and you could just show up in black bloc and be doing the wrong thing and they'll know exactly that you don't belong there. So do you want to kind of touch on that, like some of the things that they do that the public may not even understand? Like I said, the leaf blower thing, the list goes on. There's all kinds of little positions that they designate to people at their direct action events throughout the nation, throughout the world.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this interview because I first met you, actually, we were both at Chats, and then subsequently you came many, many times to Portland and in other places. And um, you're one of the few journalists who was on the ground continuously over a period of months. So you got to see particularly the evolution of their tactics in the Pacific Northwest and how sophisticated it became. You're right that you can't just put on a black mask and wear black and come in and expect that they'll just treat you like a member. I think a lot of some people who've interviewed me, they ask like, "Oh, what did you learn? Did they spill all their secrets?" And it's like, no, they're very careful about, and they recognize one another. Obviously, they know who their comrades are, even though their comrades are masked up. They can recognize them from the way they walk, the body shape, and all that. So there was a time when I actually got busted when I was undercover. Um, Again, like you said, doing one of these probably small missteps that they notice immediately and were confident it was me and nearly assaulted me, but I got away. Um, I think I write in the book, there's this whole chapter on the uprisings in Portland, which were the riots that occurred for more than 120 days throughout 2020. So, uprising was the term that they used to describe what they were doing, by the way. They were organized into different units when they were rioting every night. So, for example, in July, which was probably at the peak in terms of numbers, because that's when thousands of people were trying to
Yeah.
break into the federal courthouse in downtown Portland, and they were trying to burn it down. So you had factions that included people, like you said, with the leaf blowers, which looks quite innocuous, but they're an important part of the riot. So what they do is, when the federal law officers were dispersing tear gas to try to clear out the rioters, dozens and dozens of people with the leaf blowers would work together to blow all the tear gas out of the way so that the rioters could come back and start attacking again. They had a whole faction of people who have these high powered lasers that, it looks like a light show when you're there, but when it's shining in your eyes, it causes permanent damage to your vision, which is what happened to the federal officers. So they had people who were blinding them from hundreds of yards away, really far back. And then people up the front were throwing projectiles. It incrementally became more bold in terms of what they were willing to throw. So in May and June, before a lot of national and international journalists came to Portland, what I was seeing was they were throwing rocks in concrete, the typical. They were throwing water bottles that were frozen. That becomes a dangerous and potentially deadly weapon. They were throwing canned food, again, also deadly, potentially deadly weapon. And then later on, they kind of escalated to using these homemade IEDs. So they were like modified commercial fireworks that were extremely loud, like could really injure your ears. And they were throwing it at the feet of these federal officers. And the explosion, it's loud. It's like a mini bomb. And you can actually feel it from a distance away because it's so loud. It led to some of the officers getting burns. They were bringing power tools to try to cut down one of the fencings that was set up around that courthouse. So, it was a war zone. Like people, in addition to that, they also brought guns and knives and bats and crowbars. There was a person who was federally charged who brought a machete. It's these were acts of domestic terrorism, and the response from the politicians in my home city were to condemn law enforcement and to praise the actions of the extremists. They were calling them people who were fighting for racial justice, and that's how the media was framing it as well. The Antifa were also using human body shields. So I think there's actually a lot of analogies in their tactics and what jihadists do, for example, and there's a certain amount of similarities in their worldview as well. So
Even
for
babies.
example,
I don't know, not so much maybe Antifa, but I remember when I was there last summer, the viral clip that went up, you had some Black Lives Matter activists walking around with little babies in their hand, like begging cops to shoot them. Using them as I'm not laughing that it's a baby. I'm laughing because it's like Black Lives Matter ends up getting nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, but these are the same people that walk around with babies at riots, egging police on to shoot them, using them as human shields because they know a police officer is not going to do that. And if they do, it's a viral clip and it just starts all over again. That's one thing I want you to touch on this, Andy. You know this for a fact. Antifa, I know you've been there. I've been there. Elijah's been there. Everyone that's covered this. what they do is they antagonize, sometimes for hours. They'll be outside of the ICE facility, outside of the federal courthouse, and you don't see this. They'll antagonize and call out police officers for hours until they finally come out at like 10 p.m., 11 p.m. at night and finally deal with these people, because they start to try and burn down an ICE facility with police officers inside. But the mainstream media, especially locally in Portland, won't show until the police officers begin to actually take action against. It's like Antifa will sit there and be like, come on, shoot me, shoot me. Remember, what was the guy that was in Portland? He wouldn't wear shoes. What would they call him? Trombone guy or trumpet man, right? Like that guy would stand in front of the courthouse, shoot me, until they, like for hours, until finally they would, after him throwing rocks. It kind of touched on that, how they antagonize. They want this stuff. They want this to happen.
So the number of dedicated militant Antifa is relatively small, which is why they depend so much on calling their comrades from neighboring cities to come there. So there was a lot of Antifa from Washington State, like Seattle and other cities, also from Corvallis and Eugene, who came up to Portland. And because their numbers are relatively small, and by relatively, I'm talking about in the hundreds, they needed thousands to be there for them to be particularly effective when they were most violent. So they really depended a lot on the creation of propaganda video. And they had a whole class of willing so-called journalists who were willing to do that. So like you said, they would not just be egging them, law enforcement, on for hours. They're not just standing there yelling, they're like actually throwing projectile weapons and throwing explosives at the building and forcing the police to actually respond. And then when the officers finally respond, strategically who they have at the front are, you said, like the wall of moms, the wall of veterans, the wall of dads, people who bring their children and such. And then you get this footage that looks like, oh, they just suddenly, without warning, came out to shoot tear gas at peaceful protesters, when that's not what was happening at all. The peaceful protesters were strategically placed in the front. Everyone else behind them was throwing projectile weapons, severe and
even Ted Wheeler walked out there to try and put out those optics. Remember?
Yes, and he came over when, I was on the ground that night, actually. I was right by Ted Wheeler incognito. So the rioters had set fire to the base of the courthouse, and then Ted Wheeler came. He didn't notice the fire, and then there's all this video of him coughing because of the tear gas. And he also subjected his security detail to that, unfortunately. And then he went out to the media, and there were all these tweets about how the federal law enforcement were like essentially an occupying force, that the federal government was not welcome in Portland. So they were enabling everything that was going on. And yeah, that's Portland. I'm sure we have a lot to say about the Seattle Autonomous Zone as well, which you were at.
That's a whole another story. And it's like one thing that I've always tried to communicate to people is their organization tactics are very militarized. I've had conversations with people in the military, and I've seen literature that Antifa studies from Europe and different foreign countries when it comes to their direct action and causing rebellion and insurrection. They're very organized, and what I always want people to understand is, like, there are roles that are issued out to some of these people when you see this on the news. Like I said, the leaf blower, that's a role. The shields, that's a role. The people that are actually throwing things at cops, they're always in the back. They come to the front behind the shields, they do their stuff, and then they bail out of there. That's a role too. There's even communications. Antifa will walk around with radios, not in Black Bloc. I learned this in Portland the hard way. There's dudes that walk around not wearing Black Bloc. They act as surveillance, or they are surveillance. They take a look at who's in the crowd. They have radios on them. They're not wearing Black Bloc because the average person is going to be like, oh, that's not Antifa. That's just some dude. That's their surveillance. They literally have people that walk around their direct action, not wearing Black Bloc, making friends with people, getting intel from people, asking them, oh, hey, what are you doing here? Oh, where are you from? And if you're like a dumb journalist and you don't understand that, you're going to end up having a conversation with an Antifa militant surveillance individual telling them everything that you know. Oh, I'm here undercover to cover this. What are you doing? Like, I've had conversations with dudes in Portland, and I'm like, these dudes are straight up like they don't interrogate, but they do try and find out who you are. And I think there's this whole system to it that the public does not understand, and it's dangerous.
Yeah, there's so the intel gathering is really important aspect of Antifa's operations. So you talked about those who are the role you're describing are those who are the scouts. So they can be on foot and or also on bicycles, in cars. The role of the Antifa in the cars is important as well because they do act as like a physical blockade in the street. And then on top of that, they also, they're able to drive around and surveil if there's police coming in or anybody that they deem to potentially be a threat. In the cars, frequently they will also have supplies that will aid their comrades. It can be so they can be weapons or projectiles or water, whatever. It was a very self-sustained and sophisticated model of rioting, and they were learning from each other in different cities as well. So after the riots in Minneapolis, for example, which were among some of the most violent in the country, one of the Antifa think tanks actually published an after action report on like what worked, what didn't work, how did we take the one of the police stations in Minneapolis? How do we manage to burn it down? How do we do that in other places? And that was used to influence a lot of what happened in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle, because they did something similar in that they actually forced police to evacuate. And then once police left, they moved in and created a hard border, a no-go zone, and claimed it as their own territory.
Absolutely. I think I just want to insert this comment. I think obviously the most strategic I saw it was in Portland, but what I saw was interesting was in Kenosha, because I was in Kenosha night one.
Mm-hmm.
I was there like 3-4 hours after Jacob Blake was shot, covered that whole thing. Antifa wasn't there on the first night. That was just a lot of BLM crazies going ballistic. It was the second night and the third night when they came from different states. All of a sudden it was organized. There were Antifa even having arguments with some of the locals that I wouldn't call Black Lives Matter, but they were just black dudes that were living in the area. And they were having arguments with some Antifa militants because Antifa, they antagonize, they try and start stuff. They were trying to burn down a local library. These dudes in Black Bloc with riot shields, they show up, and other guys that are not in Black Bloc, all the scouts, they show up to this library. They're trying to burn it down. They're trying to encourage this little black kid to burn it down. I watched this with my own eyes. It was crazy. And some of the black local guys that I don't think they were Black Lives Matter, they look like they lived there because they were pissed. They're like, who are you guys coming from these different states? You guys don't even live here. We live here. That's our kids' library. You're trying to burn that down? What does that have to do with Jacob Blake? Why do you guys come out here? Where are you from? Where are you? Like they encounter gangsters sometimes, bro. And like Antifa doesn't know what to do because they're in like territory that they're not supposed to be in, trying to start anarchy. And I've seen this. I don't know if you've seen this in different states, but I've seen where Antifa crosses the wrong paths with some straight gangster dudes and they get dealt with.
Yeah, so Kenosha, right. The videos that I was seeing that you and our friends were putting out there on the ground, you could see the same organizing tactics that have been practiced and refined in other places, like the riot shields, for example, in the shield formations. And the anecdote you just described, I've seen that in other places as well, where the Antifa will bring weapons and hand them out like candy, and they particularly try to give it to people who are just sort of there as opportunists and not necessarily tied to the movement. And they seek those people out because if they get arrested and charged, they can't tie it back to any like organized element. So frequently they will entice youth, black youth or white youth, any young people,
Yeah.
juveniles. They will also give weapons to vagrants as well. And that's also a big pull of having like the food and the drinks and the tents and all that when they create the operation base. It's to pull in vagrants as well. Regarding Kenosha, one thing is important to mention that there were people from Seattle and Portland who were arrested there, who drove all the way from the West Coast with their vans.
Yep.
One of the vans that police had stopped with Washington state plates. They had like canisters of gasoline in the vehicle, some fireworks and other commercial mortar type stuff like
Hmm.
that. So yes, there was people not just from other parts of Wisconsin who came to Kenosha, but around the country.
Even the West Coast. Andy, let's transition to real quick. Your book does deal with aspects of the future, right? The future of leftist violence, right? What we've already seen is I think a lot of people kind of blamed, I mean, the radical left blamed Trump for everything under the sun, including the riots, BLM, Antifa. But now here we are in 2021. We have a new president. Joe Biden has been, in my opinion, installed, and they're still continuing. There was I think a BG on the scene was on the ground in Washington, D.C. this past weekend, capturing footage of Black Lives Matter and some aspects of Antifa in D.C. chanting to burn it down. This hasn't gone away. Then there's been other riots, even on Inauguration Day. Portland was freaking lit as always. And I want to ask you this first. Why does Antifa hate Joe Biden? I know it's a basic question we both know the answer to, but there are people out there that cannot understand why they hate Biden too. If you can give like a very basic answer to that question, I think it'd be very beneficial for the listeners.
So the book seeks to dispel some misconceptions, and the right has a lot of misconceptions about Antifa. One of the big ones, I would say probably the biggest, is that these are Democrats and Joe Biden voters. That's a wrong understanding of them. Antifa hate Joe Biden just as much as they hate Trump because he's the president of the US, and they hate the United States. They want to see the US destroyed. So they don't recognize any political authority. They don't recognize any political party. They may have allied when it was convenient with some Democrats because it helped them with crowdfunding and things like that, and it helped them mainstream their message. But that was just a strategy. This opposition to Trump that was sort of the basis for their rise from the fringe far left to more of the mainstream left. That resistance to Trump is always a pretextual. Their real hatred is for the U.S. because they view the U.S. as an imperialistic fascist state, and that it exports fascism around the world in the form of capitalism and other liberal ideas. By liberal, I'm referring to like Enlightenment, liberal values. They view all of that as fascistic. So, for example, you hear them, the reason how they justified, like why they justify the acts of preemptive political violence against their political opponents, like punching Nazis, what they say, or going out and stealing and beating people who wave an American flag or have a Trump hat. They view, in their understanding, free speech is what caused Hitler to happen, what caused the Holocaust to happen. So if they can stop wrong think, wrong speak, that they can stop fascism, which is why. So they're not just concerned about your actions or what you actually say. They don't want you to think certain things, and they will use violence to terrorize you into thinking differently or just shutting up. So you mentioned some of the riots that have continued in recent months after Election Day, even when it was known that Biden had won. And some people were surprised to see them rioting. I wasn't. They've been calling consistently for the abolishment of the United States and the American philosophy. So the day after Election Day in Portland, They ride him downtown, was smashing businesses one by one by one. And Portland is especially vulnerable because of all of the economic damage from COVID. It's a heavy foodie town, and I think 1 in 5 restaurants have closed in Portland. So they're smashing what small businesses actually still have a storefront. They also smashed up a church that provides outreach and charity to Portland's homeless community. Then also, like on New Year's Eve, they rioted again outside the Justice Center. And then on Inauguration Day, they in Portland destroyed the DNC office. In Seattle, they smashed up some of the tourist shops. And they do all that with this goal of, they feel particularly empowered right now because they view that their acts of incremental property destruction has the potential to sort of push a city over the edge in terms of past a point of no return. And by that, I'm referring to the city has already had severe economic damage. Police budgets have been slashed by the tens or hundreds of millions. And they want to make recovery, like going back to a prosperous life, impossible. They want to push beyond that. They want to destabilize. They want to create a power vacuum so that they can move in and essentially replace the police, replace authority figures. That's why when they did Chaz, like that was a really sort of small scale version of what they would like to do globally. They want to create these communes that they say where there's no property, everything's shared. But as you saw on the ground, what happens in Chaz when there's no government, you don't have a utopia. What you have is violence, attempted rapes, shootings, and murders.
Total lawlessness. Andy, I have 2 more questions for you before I let you go, man. I know it's late for you, and I appreciate you, and all the viewers appreciate you hanging out with us tonight. So in terms of the new administration, we've seen some changes even in social media. We saw like this, obviously all the Q accounts, like I think over 70,000 were just nuked in like a few days. But we also saw a move against a lot of well-known Antifa organizing accounts on Twitter get wiped out as well. I think I have my own opinions. I have my own views as to maybe why, but I am genuinely curious. Why do you think Twitter is starting to finally take action against some of these accounts on Twitter?
They probably recognize that these accounts have been instrumental in promoting and organizing riots, but I think this is my speculation. I think they thought that maybe having that type of physical resistance to the Trump administration was something that they were willing to tolerate. The far left is less useful for big tech now after with the current administration, but we also shouldn't overstate the efforts that, like, let's say Twitter has taken to ban some of these accounts. They have done a handful, but some of the prominent ones are still up, like the Youth Liberation Front, which is the Portland Antifa group that organized most of the riots last year and ongoing riots. Rose City Antifa is still up. So, to me, it kind of seems just like crumbs, what Twitter was doing, kind of like showing, hey, oh, we're not biased. Look, we're going after some of these far left accounts. And it doesn't debilitate Antifa in the same way that it does the right-wing movement when they're all like wiped out, because these people they already run their accounts anonymously anyway, and they're already connected to one another in these networks. So you can see some of these smaller Antifa accounts that were promoting some of these riots. You'll see they were having like hundreds or thousands of retweets, which is not an easy task to do. And if you look on their follower count, most of them, it was really small. Like this is not like something organic of how somebody could just suddenly get so many retweets. And the reason why they were able to do all that is because they share it through their Telegram chat rooms or the Signal chat rooms or their Discords. So they have other ways to just sort of rebuild right away. Even when one account is shut down, they just open up another one, and then they have all the people that are already connected to another follow them again.
Gotcha. Last question, Andy. In terms of the future, what are your predictions? What are you seeing on the horizon without Trump in office any longer? What do you see kind of beginning to cultivate in the USA with Biden in office? What's Antifa's role and BLM? What do you kind of see happening within the next 4 to 8 years potentially with a Democrat in office?
I think I think by turning a blind eye the past 4 years, the elected officials on the left have allowed a apparatus to develop that was rudimentary 4 years ago, but it's much more organized and sophisticated now. And even without the support of, let's say, Mayor Ted Wheeler or Mayor Jenny Durkin of Seattle, it doesn't really matter anymore because the structures are already developed and they're self-sustaining. The streams of funding have also been established through these Cash App and Venmo accounts. I mean, Drew, like the riots in Portland, the riot gear and the food and the accommodation, the travel costs, they were raising hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
And the bail fund itself in Portland raised $1.3 million. So one of the people was held on, I think,
Which included body armor as well.
that's right, riot gear and all that. One of the people had a bail, I believe, of $250,000, and they got that covered by the bail fund. And most of the charges get dropped, by the way, so the money is just returned back. So then they just reinvest it, and they were giving grants to other Antifa cells as well. But anyways, so like we seen Ted Wheeler, like maybe in January, he mentioned Antifa by name, and I think that was the first time he did it ever. And he's been in office since the beginning of 2017. And so he's kind of come around on it, but it's like too little, too late.
Yeah.
I mean, they rioted outside his home. They literally chased him outside of it to force him to move away from where he was living. They've assaulted him at restaurants. They chased him down in public. He's scared of them. Antifa and BLM have shown up outside the Seattle mayor's house. She's says she's not running for re-election. So all these cowards, they can retire and go have a good life out in the suburbs somewhere, but the policies, what they allow to grow, will continue in their cities. So I don't really see. I'm not hopeful, for example, that the current administration will use the DOJ, the FBI to investigate and break up some of these Antifa networks, because the federal officials weren't able to do that under the last administration, and Trump was extremely anti-Antifa, whereas Biden and the people around him, they don't understand what it is. They don't even really want to acknowledge it. So I don't have any faith in the federal government doing anything. I think Antifa would just continue to grow, and they're going to wait for an opportunity to exploit some type of event. So, last year was the death of George Floyd that sparked, and then everything after that, like Jacob Blake and all that, it didn't even matter. It's like, as long as there was any Black person who was killed by police, regardless of the circumstance, regardless if that suspect was being violent or had a weapon, it didn't matter. People were just going out to riot. I think that's kind of like the new playbook. They just use and exploit certain events. And even when they don't have events to do, they still take to the streets to intimidate people. So what just happened over the weekend in DC with the Antifa shutting down the streets, chanting, "We will burn it down," and they had scuffles with police. Police were really good at preventing a full riot from breaking out because they didn't allow the Antifa to actually go up and harass the people who were dining on the streets, which is what they usually do, start confronting people out trying to just have dinner. But it's like, there was no reason for them to be out then, but they still were. So it doesn't matter if there's a reason or not a reason. They still organize. They're still active in Portland. They've directed most of the rioting in Portland against the ICE facility, which
Yep.
is something they have been pivoting towards for many months now. So they just have endless things to want to destroy, and that's the thing with their ideology. They the only thing they're really good at is destruction and causing misery. When it comes to building up their own people, their own communities, they can't make their own food, they can't grow their own food. Child's was a welfare state. It was only able to function because people were pouring in hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations. People were giving their time and food, thinking that these were actually people fighting for social justice.
Absolutely. And when it all goes down, we'll be right there to give the world a front row seat to it. Andy, I want to thank you for joining me tonight, man. I know it's late for you, so we all appreciate you hanging out with us tonight. I know with the new book and everything, there's a lot been going on. And how can the people support you? Where can they find your book? How can they go about doing that?
The book is available wherever books are sold. So you can go on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million. Um, in terms of continuing to follow my work, my website is andy-ngo.com. I have Patreon and Subscribestar. It's really important to support independent journalists like Drew, like myself, like others, because corporate media, they're not really interested in providing the resources to cover this beat accurately. So it's really thanks to the independent videographers who put their own life and well-being at risk to record that footage. So by the way, I really have to thank you, Drew, because I mean, you broke a lot of these stories. Like, we didn't even get a chance to talk about what happened to Adam Hayner in Portland, the man who was drop kicked in the head by a BLN security guy in downtown Portland. I mean, that was caught on video because of your work, because of Caitlin Delmido's work. All the people there who have press on, they weren't there. And even if they were, they wouldn't have recorded that. So it's really up to the independent journalists to bring the truth to the public on Antifa.